Welcome, boys and ghouls, to the Cor-MANIA Hallo-weekend special. So, yeah, we're a bit late for the 31st, but it was on a Thursday this year, and if you're like me, you're doing your partying now. So let's put on those costumes one more time and check out a quartet of monster movies from the 70s and 80s, brought to us by New World Pictures.
You'll meet her at night, in a dark place. She's beautiful, and she's waiting for you. Waiting to love you to death.
Tonight we begin with Velvet Vampire, an artsy, erotic horror film from the swingin' 70s. It retells a pretty standard story of the mysteriously sexy vampire who entraps and corrupts an innocent couple. Except in this case, the vampire is a beautiful woman, and instead of a Transylvanian castle, we have a groovy mansion in the California desert. With dune buggies! The vapidly pretty Susan and her husband Lee, played by Michael Blodgett from Beyond the Valley of the Dolls, meet the glamorous Diane at an art show, which appears to be highlighting the works of Walter Paisley from Bucket of Blood. Diane invites them to visit her for the weekend at her compound in the desert, and before long they find themselves trapped in a web of psychological manipulation, sexy dream sequences, and mysterious murders. The story is ultimately pretty simple and occasionally a little silly, but the strength of this movie are its cool visuals and the completely genuine performances given by the actors. Diane the Vampire is played by model and actress Celeste Yarnall, who brings a lot of gravitas and poise to the role and almost seems too classy to be starring in an exploitation film. During scenes where she is seducing her guests, or just secretly observing them through a mirror, she displays the perfect balance of elegance, aggression, and desperation that's quintessential to being a vampire.
You're good to me, Juan. You've always been good to me.
Aside from the fact that she's just ridiculously gorgeous, her personal magnetism and some vivid use of color make it tough to look away from her in each scene, drawing the audience in the same way she draws in her prey. This is especially clear in the repeated dream sequences, which features some gorgeous imagery of the desert and a very surreal look. It's like a Salvador Dali painting, but with nudity. Unfortunately, the regular couple of Lee and Susan usually come off as pretty lame in comparison, simply because of what the script demands of them. Lee's kind of a douchebag, and Susan is especially annoying, as she's not only really stupid, but also whiny. It seems like literally all she does for the first half of the movie is complain about anything and everything.
Lee? I'd like one too.
Sure.
I knew we shouldn't have come.
Well, there's plenty of sun. You can help your tan along.
Lee, I have tried it. I just don't like the taste of raw meat.
Please.
I just don't feel like it.
You'll pretty much be rooting for Lee and Diane to end up together by the end, although it's not much of a surprise that things don't really work out. The soundtrack is a mixed bag. There's a spooky guitar theme you've been hearing, which plays during the sexy and mysterious scenes, and there's also a really cool blues song near the beginning.
Well, when you can't do evil, you almost lose your mind.
Unfortunately, the scary scenes forgo such classy choices and rely on musical jump scares, using obnoxious organ stings that feel like the soundtrack is stabbing you in the face. Oh, electronic organ, you were the theremin of the 1970s. Also, after all of these gorgeous location shots out in the desert, you kinda have to wonder why the filmmakers decided to set their climactic final confrontation in a 70s bus station. Is there any uglier location in the entire universe? Although, in classic Corman fashion, this whole chase sequence was shot without any permits, so it's kinda cool to think that all the people in the background there are just regular LA bystanders. They must see this all the time. Overall, Velvet Vampire is an ethereal, occasionally beautiful movie that focuses on the social aspects of the vampire mythos over the supernatural ones. Through most of the film, it's not completely obvious whether Diane is actually a vampire or just a deeply delusional woman, because the scares here are more psychological than monstrous. As a horror movie, it's very tame by exploitation standards, but there's a classiness to the story that would have made buckets of gore feel out of place. Corman was reportedly unhappy with the final product, mostly because it was impossible to peg down exactly where it fit in terms of genre. It's got all the sex of an exploitation movie, but without the trashiness, and all the plot devices of a horror movie, but without much blood, preventing it from falling fully into either style. At the time, Velvet Vampire was stuck on a double bill with the Italian feature Scream of the Demon Lover for the drive-in scene, but it was playing in art theaters in other cities. Although it had trouble finding an audience when it first came out, this movie has since become a cult classic, and I recommend it personally, if only for the captivating performance of Celeste Yarnall and the great cinematography. I'm pretty sure that color of red isn't actually found in nature.
Bloodstone. I couldn't help myself. I had to have it. There is no life without blood, and here it is trapped forever in these tiny red veins.
What evil science was practiced in this laboratory of nightmares? Who is this irresistible creature who has an insatiable love for the dead? What dread terror stalked the townspeople?
Don't let the trailer fool you. Lady Frankenstein isn't really the fantastical orgy of monstrous carnality that the narrator promises, no matter how awesome his voice may be.
Only the monster she creates can satisfy her strange desires.
What we actually get is an interesting continuation of the classic Frankenstein tale, in which Dr. Frankenstein is killed by his own creation, but his beautiful and talented daughter uses the same transplant process to transform her middle-aged fiancé into a swarthy hunk with enough super strength to destroy the original monster and avenge her father's death. This isn't a bad story, really, but the execution leaves a lot to be desired in terms of excitement and action. Both kinds of action. First of all, I do have to admit that I've never been a big fan of the gothic Euro horror genre as a whole. Italy and Spain enjoyed a horror movie boom in the 60s and 70s, since they were covered with authentic historical castles that provided the perfect ambiance for monsters and mad scientists, but the story conventions of the genre usually result in movies that are just, well, dull. Lady Frankenstein is a good example of this, as long sections of the movie are just one measured conversation after another, with flat dialogue, flat cinematography, and a flat soundtrack. It seems that well-dressed people in the 1800s spent more time solemnly reflecting in parlors than any other demographic in history. You can really tell these movies were made for drive-ins and grindhouses where they don't expect the audience to be paying close attention, because a lot of the story seems downright perfunctory. We, as viewers, already know the creation of Frankenstein's monster and how it goes, so do we really need to see it on screen one more time?
But to create life, shouldn't man leave that to God?
Here on Earth, man is God.
It seems like a lot of scenes here were included simply because the filmmakers thought they were required, while a more inventive writing and directing team would have found a way to include those necessary story elements, but use up less time. I mean, it takes half an hour to get to the first monster's creation, but they could have just put the entire "It's alive" sequence under the opening credits, and then gotten to the new material sooner, right? We should remember, though, this movie came out a long time before home video's existence, so maybe the plot of Frankenstein just wasn't so universally understood and people needed a refresher. Maybe. The entertainment this film does provide is mostly for so bad it's good reasons, since the producers of this movie were trying to recreate the universal horror Frankenstein, but with a Hammer horror budget. The creature looks a bit scary, and that derpy eye makes him look like the Toxic Avenger's long-lost grandfather, but there are a lot of random scenes of him tromping around the countryside trying to be frightening, and broad daylight does the costume no favors. This monster copies a lot of elements from the old Boris Karloff version, like the stiff arm movements and the clunky platform shoes. There's even a callback to that old scene in the Universal movie where the monster throws the little girl into the pond, only this time it's a hot naked girl. Because Europe. The movie's greatest strength is the titular Tanya Frankenstein, played by Rosalba Neri, credited here as Sarah Bay and dubbed into English by American actress Linda Gary. Writer Edward D. Lorenzo stated that he wanted to make a feminist horror movie, and Tanya is certainly a strong female character. She's intelligent, capable, and not afraid to use her scientific genius to get exactly what she wants. Of course, it wouldn't be a Frankenstein story if the scientist weren't undone by her own hubris by the end, but during most of the film, she's ruthless yet easy to root for. You actually want Tanya and her boyfriend to get away with their various crimes.
All my life I've wanted to do something like that.
You can now, Charles. You're a young man again. Handsome, strong, intelligent, and beautiful man.
It's like Natural Born Killers, but in a castle. Despite a few highlights, the drab, plodding style of gothic horror is just too much of a burden on what could have been a good story. It was billed as a sexy version of Frankenstein, and if they'd actually made it sexy, like Velvet Vampire, it could have been classic. It's not really a bad movie, just kind of boring. And if you're a fan of Euro horror or Frankenstein, there are better options. There's practically an entire Frankenstein's beautiful daughter subgenre if you're curious. Personally, I recommend the sublimely ridiculous Jesse James meets Frankenstein's daughter. That's a good one.
Save your strength, Jesse James. You will need it.
Lady Frankenstein was a valiant attempt to stitch together a bunch of different cinematic influences, but ultimately, it never quite comes to life.
Space and time. Two dimensions we dream of conquering. But perhaps they have already been conquered. Not by man, but a form of intelligence far more evolved and far more powerful. A time walker.
I remember first seeing Time Walker as a kid, since it was actually an episode of Mystery Science Theater 3000 under the alternate title Being from Another Planet.
Oh, you know, Being from Another Planet, I didn't have a lot to do with this film. It's no play on words there.
I always thought it was stupid to call it that, since it ruins the major plot twist. The mummy in this movie is not actually a mummy, but an alien that's been awakened from suspended animation. Even though Time Walker is a better title, since it preserves that secret, the posters literally show a gray right there. It's like the movie is intent on spoiling itself. The trailer is even worse though, and I'm not sure why they completely threw away the chance to surprise the audience with the true nature of the monster. I guess in the early 80s, maybe a killer alien drew a bigger audience than a killer mummy. So, twist ending aside, is it worth watching? Well, even as a kid, I recalled Being from Another Planet as one of the least bad movies Mystery Science Theater ever did. It's competently made and inventive, if not necessarily action-packed. The story begins with the discovery of a second mummy hidden in the tomb of King Tut, which is brought to a college in California for examination, and hey, that looks like the same college from Curse of Bigfoot. Do they have a special institute for mummies that aren't actually mummies research or something? Anyway, after an overdose of radiation, the mummy awakens and starts wandering the campus, murdering horny co-eds in the search for the objects they stole from his tomb. One of my favorite things about this movie is how every classic mummy trope gets reinvented in a science fiction context. For instance, instead of recovering a lost treasure, the mummy has to collect the pieces to his high-tech communications device in order to escape to his home planet. Instead of hieroglyphics, we get futuristic wiring schematics. Instead of destroying his victims with a magical curse, he carries an alien fungus that dissolves people's flesh on contact. You get all the same plot points, but with a modern twist, which is pretty cool. The biggest weakness of the story is that the heroes don't actually come into conflict with the monster until the very end. When the mummy vanishes from his tomb, they assume it's just been stolen, not that it's walking around on its own, so we basically get two separate plots, the mummy going around killing people, and then all of the other characters trying to track down a mummy napper. It's not a direct confrontation, but more of a mystery story, which makes it especially unfortunate that they decided to throw away the mystery during marketing. Since the audience knows the score already, we're just sitting around waiting for the heroes to catch up. Fortunately, the scenes where the monster stalks its victims are pretty well done. Rather than just having the monster be inexplicably fast for a dead body, they actually took the trouble to establish that this guy gets around by levitating, although the effect used for this ability sometimes makes him look like he's just tooling around on a skateboard. Radical, dude! The best sequence of the movie is definitely when the hero's girlfriend gets chased through a library, as the monster's design is very simple, but actually pretty intimidating, and the part where he tears apart an elevator with her inside of it is very cool. Scenes like this really convey the feeling that the mummy is an unstoppable juggernaut, which is how mummies were always meant to be. Vampires are seductive, werewolves are ferocious, but the mummy is scary because he will never, ever give up. So considering that there's very little mystery left in the story and the action is limited, is Time Walker worth your time to see? If the 80s are your favorite era of monster movies, then Time Walker fits that niche well enough. The monster design is good, the effects for the flesh-eating curse are appropriately gruesome, and there are some good suspenseful scenes sprinkled throughout. In my opinion, this movie does just fine on its own, but if you're not sure about it, there's not really any harm in watching the Mystery Science Theater version to get some extra laughs. Otherwise, you're going to be stuck to the comedic stylings of this guy.
They held a press conference to show off their new mummy, but when they opened the coffin, guess what?
It wasn't a mummy. It was a daddy.
Oh my God.
No, it wasn't anything. The coffin was empty.
Empty?
As a tomb.
I wonder how much they paid for that thing.
Whatever it was too much.
Jamie, I think the Institute is in grave trouble.
Oh, Dick.
Sorry.
Somewhere between reality and illusion is the nightmare.
I've been making my living scaring people for a long time. I'm not about to stop now.
I think I know the difference between what's real and what's not.
Orville Kruger specializes in nightmares. Orville Kruger's greatest nightmare is about to begin.
Grotesque is a film with one objective, to mess around with the viewer's expectations of horror movies. Like the poster art symbolizes, it's a movie within a movie within a movie, and it puts the viewer in a position of never knowing what's going to happen next. It actually has the opposite problem from Time Walker. The plot twists are what make the movie great, but you can't tell people what the twists are without completely ruining the experience. Now generally, I hate the innocent family held hostage by psychopaths plot structure, but only the first 30 minutes of the film actually follow that storyline. Then the plot veers in a totally new direction. I don't want to give away too many specifics since it would ruin the movie for you, but let me try and explain why the twists make the story good without revealing exactly what they are. The opening credits are played over a long, spooky monologue, which culminates with some lady getting seduced by a monster. This first segment, however, is actually a movie within a movie, demonstrating the work of this kindly old special effects artist named Orville Kruger. Yeah, popcorn and slasher movie villains. This movie likes to make the reference. His plucky daughter is played by Linda Blair from The Exorcist, and a lot of the props and costumes lying around their house are actually cameos by special effects from other horror movies. For those of you who've always wanted to see a sex scene involving the silver shamrock masks from Halloween 3, Grotesque has got you covered. Unfortunately, their family vacation is ruined by a band of coked-out criminals in search of hidden treasure, who take the family hostage and kill them off one by one. Now, all by itself, this plot would get really tedious, especially considering that the bad guys all give performances like these.
Scratch. It'll go down okay.
Okay. Do you remember Nevada? Nevada?
If you had your soul.
Get out of my face, Belle!
Actually, I take it back. This acting is amazing. Plus, hey there, Robert Zadar! Fortunately, the bad guys actually don't waste much time murdering everyone, which means the plot has to switch gears pretty quick. At this point, the monster appears and wreaks his karmic vengeance. I won't spoil exactly what the monster is, but suffice to say that he's sort of a big Jason Voorhees type, and he gets some pretty brutal kills off on the various punks. Since these characters are so incredibly loathsome and irritating, it's really satisfying to watch them get snapped in half by a mutant in a jumpsuit. Unfortunately, even this doesn't last long before the plot changes directions again, moving from a slasher to a vigilante flick. They're not shy about the sudden switch to Death Wish clone either, as shown by this absolutely brilliant piece of dialogue.
Well, fortunately for me, gentlemen, I'm outside the law. I don't need any proof.
Sounds like a man who's gonna take matters in his own hands.
Frankly, Blaine, I don't give a damn.
Just when you think the movie's turned into a pretty basic quest for revenge, though, it adds yet another twist at the end, which ties the three acts together brilliantly. If you recently saw Machete Kills, it's a lot like that movie. It's an unpretentious plot that just surges on forward, stopping through a whole bunch of genres along the way like a particularly bloody game of Candyland. I love it. Of the 4 movies in this episode, Grotesque is the one I went into expecting to like the least, but it ended up being my favorite. I guess you could say, it surprised me. The best quality for this film is that every surprise, no matter how sudden, is justified elsewhere in the movie. There are 2 kinds of bad plot twists, the ones that you see coming a mile away, or the ones that just pop up out of nowhere. For the most part, Grotesque succeeds at treading the middle ground. The movie throws you for a lot of loops, but you can look back on it afterward and realize all the elements that led up to each one. Linda Blair served as a producer on this film, and since she usually tried to do classier horror movies than this, I'm kinda surprised she was even involved. Then again, we are talking about the girl who starred opposite David Hasselhoff in Bailout. To be honest, I have no idea how Roger Corman was involved in this movie, if he even was at all. It came as the throwaway feature on a Roger Corman's Cult Classics box set, so there's gotta be some connection, but I haven't been able to figure out what it is. If you want to get technical, consider this a free bonus review. The wonderful insanity of this movie is my Halloween gift to all of you out there. Seriously, just go watch Grotesque. Do it right now. There's nothing else like it. But the horror doesn't have to end here. Stay tuned this month for more terrifying tales as we take a look at some of Corman's most critically acclaimed and star-studded films. It's Edgar Allan Poe-vember on Roger Cor-MANIA. Be seeing you.